What is suffering? We could say that suffering is the belief, conviction, that feels visceral, like it's real, that things could be other than they are. As simple as that is, the statement seems so simple. Even the solution may seem simple, but turns out not to be that simple. But it does turn out to be true. The tiniest gap between what is and the appearance that it could be other than it is. Such a small gap creates a chasm, huge, vast chasm that can contain all of human suffering, all of human history, all of human mind identification, pain, body, delusion. The reason I say that turns out not to be so simple or as simple as it seems is in large part because the reason we have such a difficult time seeing that things can't be other than they are is because we don't see how they actually are. We see how we see how we want them to be. We see how they could be if they actually existed, if objects actually existed, if time and space actually existed in the way our minds imagine it. So we see things the way they're not. It's not just a belief. This is why we have to go so deep before we dispel such a simple belief, a simple misperception. They're kind of layered. They're kind of nested in one another. Certainly the deepest fundamental structure that makes it possible to have the appearance of a world and an internal world and an external world is the self structure. That's pretty obvious. But in and of itself, it doesn't cause things to directly appear as they're not. It just raises the propensity for that to happen. It gives the delusion, the fundamental delusion, it gives it like a home in me, in the self. And then from that, we can posit that, well, if there's a self, we don't really decide, we don't think through this and then create a self, we create a structure on top of a self, but this is very much how it plays out. Because there's a separate self, separate from everything, then there must be division. The division must be an actual thing, an actual phenomenon. It seems very obvious that there are separate entities, separate people, separate things, separate times and spaces. So that's dependent upon the initial illusion of the structure of the self. And if there are separate objects, events, people, situations from a central subject, then suddenly there's a value system that comes into play, which means everything is either desirable or undesirable. Everything is either good for me or bad for me. Everything, I either want it or I don't want it, or I want more of it, or I want less of it. So once there's a value system, then there's struggle, picking and choosing, gross struggle. And at this level of experience, it's very hard to discern without any shift in identity. It's very hard to discern the difference between what I'm talking about and the practicalities of life, the practicalities of just living making choices, setting goals, talking to other people. None of the realization insights negate conventional life, really. They make it look very different. They make it look much less believable. But they don't negate the fact that we apparently make choices, that we apparently meet people, that we are apparently separate. So because of the binding of the mind-identified self, it makes it very difficult to discern between those. So then it's very woven together. It's like a fabric that's woven tightly together, and it can be very difficult to see the cracks. And it can be very difficult to even want to see the cracks, to even have any inkling at all that this isn't just how everything is. The way I think about it, I don't even know I think about it. Just the way I see the world is the way it is. It can be, maybe it's just totally, totally the job of grace to show us that that's not exactly how it is. That there are actually cracks in the armor, not in the armor, in the fabric, the woven together fabric. And those cracks, like light can shine through a crack for all kinds of reasons, but suffering is a very prominent one. Tragedies, unexpected events, intuition, sometimes a certain very deep curiosity that goes beyond intellectual curiosity. That's an opening, And then when there's some kind of alteration in identity, then there's a big opening. But a lot of the work that gets done once that occurs is in that space of essentially the value system, really believing that some things are more important, some things are less important. Picking and choosing is not just a possibility, it's what I have to do all the time or frequently. That, to me, that's really why this doesn't happen more frequently and faster, just because it's so believable, so enticing. And because the underlying distortions are so incredibly subtle that with all of that dynamism of the mind, it's very hard to confront them directly. The sense of duality, for instance. It can happen. It can dispel itself. It can randomly dispel itself. But I think it's quite rare.